January of 1864. Inside the White House, the president sat alone at his desk, counting money, one bill after another. His name was Abraham Lincoln. The money was for his valet, a free black man, dying of smallpox in a hospital bed across town. Lincoln reportedly called him the most useful man in his household. His own staff never allowed him to forget he was the least wanted. This is the story of William Johnson, the man closest to a president's body, and the man history came closest to erasing. Even the word on his grave may not be his. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Behind the Throne. In the archives holding Abraham Lincoln's papers, thousands of pages from the 4 most consuming years of his life. There survive a few notes that have nothing to do with the war. A letter of recommendation in the president's own hand. A worthy man, as I believe. A request to a cabinet secretary, asking for nothing more than a steady job for someone he trusted. And a personal check, made out to a man whose name appears in almost none of the history books most Americans have read. Tonight, we tell the story of William Johnson, the free black valet Abraham Lincoln trusted with his wardrobe, his wages, and, quite possibly, his own life. It begins in Springfield, Illinois, in the last quiet season either man would ever know. Springfield, Illinois, in the spring of 1860, was a prairie town still pretending to be something larger than it was. Its streets turned to mud after rain. Its most famous resident was a country lawyer with an unruly head of hair, a modest frame house on 8th Street, and a name that, within the year, would belong to the entire country. Before he belonged to the country, though, Abraham Lincoln belonged to a household. And in that household, before dawn most mornings, a free black man named William Johnson set a basin of hot water on a stand, stropped a razor against a strip of leather until the blade sang, and waited for Mr. Lincoln to sit down in the chair and tilt his head back. For a few minutes each morning, the future President of the United States held perfectly still while a man he barely knew drew a blade across his throat. It was, in its own quiet way, an unusual arrangement for the time. Across the country, black barbers held a strange and specific kind of standing, trusted with a white man's most exposed moment of the day, invited into rooms no other black man in town would ever enter, and still, almost without exception, unwelcome at the same man's dinner table. Johnson's trade gave him access. It did not give him belonging. The two were never the same thing, and no one in 1860 expected them to be. There is almost nothing else historians can tell you about those mornings, or about the man holding the razor. A historian who has spent years combing Springfield's surviving records for William Johnson has come back, again and again, with almost nothing to show for it, no birth record, no family Bible, no photograph, no letter in his own hand. His mother had been enslaved. Where he himself was born, no one now knows. He arrives in the story already half erased, a man history had not yet decided was worth remembering, in a state that made his kind of freedom a fragile, conditional thing. Illinois in 1860 did not welcome free black residents. Its own laws discouraged them from settling at all. A man like Johnson lived there on sufferance, one bad turn of luck away from having no protection whatsoever. What is known, plainly, is this sometime around 1860. Johnson began working for the Lincolns, as a bootblack, as a barber, as a man who did whatever needed doing around a busy household with a rising political star at its center. It was not, by any measure, a position of importance. Springfield had other black barbers, other bootblacks, other men who shined the boots of lawyers and merchants, and appeared in not a single sentence written about them, then or since. For a while, Johnson seemed destined for exactly that kind of silence. But on the 19th of May, 1860, something changed, if only for an evening. Word had reached Springfield that the Republican Party, meeting in Chicago, had chosen Abraham Lincoln as its candidate for President of the United States. That night, the modest house on 8th Street filled past its walls with visitors. Party men in traveling coats, reporters with notebooks, neighbors who had known Lincoln for 30 years and now looked at him as though seeing him for the first time. Mary Todd Lincoln moved among them as hostess, gracious and watchful, already sensing what her husband's life was about to become. And it was William Johnson who stood at the door, announcing each name as it arrived, directing men twice his social standing through the hall and into the parlor, where the Lincolns waited to receive them one by one. For one evening, in one doorway, the man usually invisible to history was the first person every visitor saw. His voice was the one that said their names out loud. It would not happen again for a long time. 2 years later, a letter would leave the White House in Lincoln's own hand, describing Johnson as a worthy man, as I believe. The kind of sentence a president writes only for someone he has watched closely enough to trust. But that letter was still 2 years and a war away. In the spring of 1860, Johnson was simply the man who held a razor steady at Abraham Lincoln's throat each morning, announced his guests by name each evening, and asked for nothing in return that anyone thought to write down. By November, Lincoln had won. By February, there would be a train, a long, uncertain journey east through half a dozen states, toward a capital city that did not yet know what to make of the man it was about to receive as president, and that had already, in whispers, begun to threaten his life before he ever arrived. Johnson would go with him at least part of the way, whatever Springfield had been to either man. However small, however unrecorded, it was the last place they would ever live an ordinary life. The house on 8th Street was closed up and rented out. On the lawn, in the last cold days of winter, the family's furniture went piece by piece in a hurried public sale. Chairs, a bedstead, kitchen goods, to neighbors who had once been merely neighbors and were now, suddenly, buying the belongings of a president. Somewhere among the crates and the trunks being carried out to the wagons, a valet who had never been anyone in particular kept doing the one thing that had always been his, standing close enough to a powerful man's throat to be trusted completely, while rarely being asked what he thought about any of it. On the morning of departure, a crowd gathered at the Springfield depot in a cold drizzle to see the president-elect off. Lincoln stood on the rear platform of the train and spoke without notes, telling the crowd he owed everything he was to this place, and that he did not know if he would ever return to it alive. Men in the crowd wept openly. Whether William Johnson stood near enough to hear it, no record says. What the record does say is that he boarded a train that week bound for Washington in the president-elect's traveling party, leaving behind the only town in America where anyone had known his face for more than a year. Washington was waiting. So, without anyone yet saying so out loud, was a White House staff that had already decided, before Johnson ever set foot inside its doors, that a man as dark-skinned as he was did not belong among them. The journey east was not finished without one more test. As the train neared Baltimore, word reached the party of a credible plot to kill the president-elect as his car passed through the city. The published schedule was abandoned. In the deep hours of the night, Lincoln slipped onto a different train, accompanied, by the only confirmed account of that stretch, by his old friend and self-appointed protector Ward Hill Lamon. Whether William Johnson rode the secret train or the public one, no surviving document says, and it would be dishonest to claim either. By morning, Both trains and both men had reached a capital that did not yet trust its own peace. Washington, D.C., in March of 1861, was a city under canvas and rumor, half finished, half defended, waiting to see whether it would survive as the capital of a divided country. Inside the executive mansion, the new president's household staff had its own quieter war underway, and William Johnson had just walked into the middle of it. He was placed on the payroll within days, officially as a fireman, a title that meant little beyond a wage and a foot in the door. What it did not buy him was welcome. Every servant already working in the mansion was, without exception, light-skinned, and had held their place for years under an unspoken hierarchy that had never once been disturbed by a face as dark as Johnson's. There was no formal rule that said so. There did not need to be. The staff made it clear in the particular. Silent ways a household can make things clear. A task reassigned, a door not held, a name left off a list. That Johnson's arrival was not going to be treated as an addition. It was going to be treated as an intrusion. Lincoln noticed. He always seemed to notice where Johnson was concerned. Within his first week in office, with a civil war gathering on the horizon, with a cabinet still being assembled, with a country coming apart in pieces, the President of the United States took the time to write a letter trying to solve the problem of one servant's unhappiness. The difference of color between him and the other servants, Lincoln wrote, is the cause of the separation. He tried the Navy Department first, appealing directly to Secretary Gideon Welles. Nothing came of it. By that November, Lincoln went a different way, asking Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase directly to find Johnson a place. Chase did. Johnson became a messenger, $600 a year. Safely out of the mansion's servant quarters and into a government office across town. It should have ended there. A quiet administrative fix to a quiet administrative problem. It did not. Johnson kept coming back. Every morning. Before his shift at the Treasury, he returned to the White House to shave the president, to lay out his clothes, to do the small, physical work of getting Abraham Lincoln ready to be looked at by the world. He had been pushed out of the household. He simply never left the man. On the 11th of March, 1862, Lincoln wrote him a personal check for $5. A small sum, hand-delivered, the kind of detail that appears in no speech and changes no policy, and that survives anyway, because someone kept the paper. The following December, when a request crossed Lincoln's desk, asking permission for Johnson to take on outside work to earn extra money, the president read it, and did not like how it was worded and refused to sign it as written. "I believe he is a good boy," he noted instead in his own hand, "and I should be glad for him to have the place if it is still vacant." He wanted Johnson to have it. He simply wanted it done properly. By then, Johnson had a family of his own in Washington, a wife, children the record does not name, a household growing in a city that offered a free black family no guarantee of safety and few guarantees of anything else. According to the surviving record, he bought a house at some point in those years on a mortgage the President of the United States personally helped guarantee. It is one line in the record, easy to read past. It meant that if Johnson could not pay, Abraham Lincoln, already carrying the weight of an entire war on his shoulders, had agreed to carry that debt as well. None of it made the newspapers. None of it was meant to. It was the kind of quiet, practical loyalty that leaves almost no trace, except in the fact that a president kept finding reasons to write letters and sign guarantees on behalf of a man whose job title, officially, had nothing to do with him anymore. Johnson had been made invisible in one direction and indispensable in another, and for nearly 2 years. That arrangement held. He served a president who could not always protect him from his own household. He returned every morning to a house that had already told him, in its own quiet way, that he did not belong in it. And every morning, he came back anyway, because the work was his, and because somewhere along the way it had stopped being only a job. By the autumn of 1863, the war Lincoln carried had grown heavier, not lighter. Armies were dying by the tens of thousands. A rebel capital still stood defiant in Richmond. And in Washington that November, the president was asked to travel to a Pennsylvania battlefield to say a few words at the dedication of a new soldiers' cemetery. A short trip, by the standards of the war, hardly worth the fuss anyone made over it at the time. Johnson packed for the journey as he always did. Neither man, boarding that train, had any reason to think it would test exactly how far this quiet, unrecorded loyalty could be asked to go. The train left Washington on the morning of November the 18th, 1863, carrying the president toward a battlefield that had, 4 months earlier, buried more men in 3 days than most American towns held in a lifetime. Lincoln had been asked to say a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of a new soldiers' cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He had written those remarks himself, on paper he carried in his coat. He had not written anything about how he felt that morning, which, by the account of those traveling with him, was not well. Smallpox was already loose in Washington that winter. It had been for weeks. In the president's own house, his young son Tad had come down with a mild case of it days before the train ever left the station. One more thing, added to a season already heavy with dying. One more thing Lincoln did not mention in the speech he was about to give. At Gettysburg the next day, he stood before the crowd and spoke for barely 2 minutes. 10 sentences. 270 some words by most later counts. That would outlive every soldier they were written to honor. Reporters in the crowd that day used their own words to describe him, and the words were not flattering. Listless. One wrote, sweating, discouraged. Lincoln delivered the speech anyway, in a voice thinner than the one he had used on other occasions, and afterward stood through the rest of the long dedication ceremony, because a president does not simply leave. No one in the crowd knew to call what they were watching an illness. They assumed it was exhaustion, and the war had made exhaustion look ordinary on every face in the country, including his. It was on the ride home that it became something else. Lincoln took to his seat in the rail car with a headache that would not lift, then a fever, then the particular cold, hot exhaustion of a body losing an argument with itself. For the 6 hours back to Washington, William Johnson sat beside him, dipping a cloth into cold water again and again, laying it against the president's burning forehead, taking it away, dipping it again. The same steady hands that had held a razor to Lincoln's throat every morning for 3 years now held a damp cloth to his skull, doing the only thing there was to do on a moving train in 1860. 3 waiting, and cooling what could be cooled, and saying very little, because there was very little to say. No one on that train car spoke of contagion. In 1863, doctors understood smallpox well enough to fear it, and not well enough to explain exactly how it moved from one body to the next. What was understood, at least by everyone who had grown up anywhere near an outbreak, was that sitting for 6 hours beside a feverish man, close enough to touch his forehead again and again with the same cloth, was not a safe place to sit. Johnson sat there anyway. It was the job, and more than the job, it was simplinary verdid, the same instinct that had him back at the White House every morning for 2 years after the mansion's own staff had told him, without ever saying it outright, that he was not wanted there. By the time the train reached Washington, Lincoln could barely stand under his own power. Within days, the diagnosis came back as smallpox. A mild strain, doctors said, one that men sometimes called varioloid, as though a gentler name could make it a gentler disease. He was confined to his bed. The rash spread. For nearly 3 weeks, the man who had just delivered what history would call the finest short speech an American president ever gave could not leave his own bedroom. Johnson stayed close through all of it. He had already been in the room for the worst of the fever. On the train, before anyone had a name for what was making the president sick. He would go on tending to him through the confinement that followed. The linens changed, the meals carried up, and mostly carried back down untouched. Visitors limited because the doctors did not yet understand how the disease traveled and would take no chances with a country that could not survive losing its president. Business did not entirely stop. It simply came to him in pieces, delivered to a sick room instead of an office. Through the ordinary chaos of a government, trying to keep functioning around a sick man, Johnson did the part of the work that never appeared on any schedule. He was simply there, in the room, doing whatever the day's illness required of him, for as long as it required it. Lincoln recovered. By the middle of December, he was back at his desk, thin but functioning, the crisis behind him. William Johnson, who had spent 6 hours with a wet cloth against a burning forehead, and God knows how many more hours since in a sick room no healthy man had reason to enter, went back to his own morning routine at the White House, not yet knowing what those hours beside the president's bed were about to cost him. The cost came due in January. It began as these things often do, quietly enough to ignore. A tiredness that did not lift. A little fever, then more of it. By the 12th of January, 1864, William Johnson was too sick to stand, and the doctors who examined him used a word the entire city of Washington had spent the previous winter learning to fear: smallpox. He was admitted to a hospital bed, one of thousands the war had already filled, except that this patient's name was known, personally, to the President of the United States, the man Lincoln had once been quoted as calling, without much fanfare, the most useful member of the presidential party. That same week, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune found Lincoln at his own desk in the executive mansion, recovered from his own bout with the disease weeks earlier. Thin but working again, and occupied, at that particular moment, with something that had nothing to do with the war. He was counting money. Paper currency, one bill at a time, laid out on the desk and recounted, and finally sealed into an envelope, which he labeled with a name and set aside with what the reporter described as unusual care. It was Johnson's pay from the Treasury Department, the wages of a messenger, too sick to walk to a paymaster's window and collect them himself. So the President of the United States did it for him, sorted the bills, folded the envelope, wrote the name across it in his own hand, a task that belonged, by any ordinary measure, nowhere near a desk where cabinet business and battlefield reports were supposed to sit. The reporter, perhaps sensing a stranger story underneath the errand, asked Lincoln whether he thought he might have given Johnson the disease himself. Passed it to him on the train from Gettysburg, in all those hours of cold cloths and closeness. Lincoln did not deny the possibility outright. "At least I think not," he said. It was not a confident answer. It was an honest one, from a man who did not actually know, and who had clearly already asked himself the same question. Sit with that question the way Lincoln had to sit with it. Somewhere across town, a man was dying of a disease the president himself had just survived. A man who had caught it, if he had caught it there, precisely because he would not leave the president's side when leaving was the safer thing to do. There was no way to know. There was also no way to stop knowing that it was possible. Of all the burdens Abraham Lincoln carried through that winter, the casualty lists, the generals, the election year beginning, this one appears in no official record at all. It only appears in the way he behaved. Around the same time, according to one historian's account of the period, a banker holding part of a debt Johnson had fallen behind on agreed to cancel half of what was owed. Once he learned who Johnson worked for and how sick the man had become. After this, the banker is said to have told Lincoln, "You can never deny that you endorse the Negro." Lincoln, by this same account, laughed. "That's a fact," he answered, "but I don't intend to deny it." Whether the exchange happened in exactly those words, no second source confirms. But the debt itself, and Lincoln's hand in relieving it, is not in dispute. He paid off what remained of Johnson's mortgage. He sent money to Johnson's family, waiting at home for news. He did, in the space of a few sick days, nearly everything a man in his position could do for another man's household, except be there in the room. He could not be there in the room. A president did not visit contagious wards, not with a war still needing him upright and a country that had already come within weeks of losing him once that winter. So the money went by envelope, the mortgage went by letter, and William Johnson, who had cared for that same president every morning for 3 years, who had pressed a cold cloth to his burning forehead for 6 hours on a train, and asked for nothing after, who had returned each day to a White House that had never quite decided to want him, lay in a hospital bed in January of 1864, being cared for by strangers, while the one man who might have sat beside him could only send paper. Notice how completely the roles had reversed. For 3 years, it was Johnson who stood beside a seated Lincoln, the razor each morning, the wet cloth on the train, the sickroom watch through December. The nearness was always his to give, and he gave it without being asked. Now the nearness was the one thing forbidden in both directions. The president could not come to the bedside. The valet could not come to the White House. Two men whose entire acquaintance had been built out of small, physical acts of care were reduced, at the end, to what could fit inside an envelope. No one recorded what Johnson said, if he said anything at all in those final days. No diary survives. No letter in his hand has ever been found, not from this illness, not from any point in his life. Everything that remains of him, right up to the end, belongs to someone else's handwriting. Outside the hospital, the war went on without pausing for either man. Inside it, a fever that had been mild in the president moved through a different body, in a different bed, tended by different hands than the ones that had tended Lincoln's own sickroom weeks earlier. Whether the sickness now consuming Johnson was the same sickness that had briefly touched Abraham Lincoln, or something the city's epidemic would have found him anyway, was a question no doctor in January of 1864 could answer with certainty. It is a question, in truth, that has never been fully answered since. William Johnson died on the 28th of January, 1864, 16 days after the diagnosis, in a hospital bed in a city that had already buried more men that decade than it could properly count. He was 30 years old, or close to it. Even his own age was never recorded with certainty, the same way his birthplace never was, the same way almost nothing about him ever was, from the first page of this story to the last. Somewhere in Washington, a wife and children, the record does not name, learned that the man who had gone off each morning to shave a president's throat was not coming home. Abraham Lincoln did not attend the funeral. A sitting president, weeks removed from his own bout with the same disease, could not risk standing over an open grave that might still carry it. What he did instead was arrange for everything else: the coffin, the service, the burial itself, and pay for all of it out of his own pocket, as he had paid off the mortgage, as he had once sealed an envelope of wages with his own hands, carefully, because it was the last practical thing left that he could do. For over a century, the story told about what happened next was a tidy one, and it is worth telling the way it was told for most of that century, before saying what is actually true. The story went like this: Lincoln had Johnson buried at Arlington, on the grounds of the old Custis, Lee estate the Union had seized from a Confederate general's family, soil that would, within months, become the nation's most solemn military cemetery. And on the headstone, the story went, Lincoln himself chose the single word carved into the stone. Not a name in full, not a date, just one word: citizen. A quiet, deliberate rebuke, some later claimed, of the Supreme Court's ruling 7 years earlier that a black man could never be a citizen of the United States at all. It became, over the decades, one of the most quoted, most repeated details in the entire Lincoln legend. Proof, if proof were needed, that the president had seen Johnson as fully, legally human, and had said so in stone. And you can understand why the story traveled the way it did. It gave the loose ends a shape. It took a man who left no letters, no portrait, no certain grave, and gave him a monument, an author, and a moral, all in a single carved word. Nations do this with their dead when the truth is too scattered to carry they tidy. For half a century, nearly everyone who told William Johnson's story ended it at that headstone, because it was the only ending anyone had. It is a beautiful story. Most of it is not true. The man who first connected that Arlington headstone to Lincoln's valet was a respected Lincoln scholar, writing in 1972. 5 years later, he admitted in his own words that he had chosen to search Arlington's records on a hunch, nothing more, and that he had never found any actual evidence tying the grave or the cemetery to the William Johnson who had shaved the president's throat and died in a Washington hospital. Later writers added the detail about the Dred Scott decision, without a single document to support it. Still later writers repeated it as established fact, the way a story gets truer, each time it is told rather than checked. By 2012, 2 historians examining the paper trail found something quieter and sadder than a conspiracy. The word, citizen, was not written for William Johnson at all. It appears on every civilian headstone in that section of Arlington. A generic label, used for any black Washingtonian buried there, before the cemetery became exclusively military, chosen by no one in particular, meant for no one in particular. They found that William H. Johnson had been one of the most common names among free black men in wartime Washington. That the headstone visible today is a replacement made in the 1990s, and that Arlington did not even exist as a cemetery yet when Johnson died, making it, by their account, one of the least likely places he could have been buried at all. The single likeliest resting place for a black smallpox victim in January of 1864, they concluded, was a different cemetery entirely, one cleared for redevelopment in 1950. 9. Its graves relocated or lost, its records incomplete. No one alive today can say with certainty where William Johnson rests, which means the erasure ran deeper than anyone had understood. In life, a White House staff worked quietly to push him out of the building. In death, the record itself finished the job. A grave misplaced by a guess, a cemetery cleared for redevelopment, a name so common it dissolves into the crowd of every other William H. Johnson in wartime Washington. Even the legend built to honor him managed, in its own way, to lose him for 50 years. America has been standing at what is very likely the wrong grave, saying the right things. What can be said with certainty is this: a president counted out a dying man's wages by hand and sealed them carefully in an envelope. A president paid off a mortgage, forgave a debt, wrote, "A worthy man," in his own hand, and asked a cabinet secretary to find a job for a servant no one else in the White House would treat as an equal. All of that happened. All of that is documented in Lincoln's own writing, beyond any reasonable dispute. The grave with the beautiful word on it may simply not be his. And somewhere, under a lawn in Arlington that was likely never meant for him, or in a burial ground redeveloped and forgotten decades ago, or in ground no one has ever thought to look, William Johnson has been waiting 160 years for someone to get his story right. There is no photograph of William Johnson, no portrait, sketched or painted, survives from a life that ended in a city where cameras were already common enough to record almost everyone else who touched the presidency that decade. If he ever looked directly into a lens, no one kept the plate. We know the shape of his days better than the shape of his face. Think of how much effort that absence represents. Not malice, just indifference, compounding year after year. Washington in the 1860s was full of portrait studios. The men and women around the presidency sat for photographs, as a matter of course, and history kept nearly all of them. Nobody thought to spend a plate on the valet. Nobody wrote down his wife's name. The record did not slam a door on William Johnson. It simply never opened one. What survives instead is paper written by other hands. A president's letters, a newspaper column, a memo about a leave of absence. Refused not because Lincoln disliked the man, but because he disliked the wording of the request. A historian's footnote, decades later, admitting that an entire resting place had been chosen on nothing but a hunch. Piece all of it together, and it does not add up to a full life. It adds up to an outline. The shape of a man traced only by people who happened to write about him in passing, on their way to writing about someone else. One of those historians, writing more than a century after Johnson died, put it as plainly as anyone ever has, that Lincoln treated him as a man, not as a servant. It is a fair judgment, as far as the record allows one. It is also, in its own way, a small tragedy, that the kindest, clearest thing anyone has ever managed to say about William Johnson was said by a stranger, 100 years after he was gone, and not by Johnson himself, in his own words, because he never left any behind. His wife lived on in Washington. So, presumably, did his children. Though no record names them, follows them, or tells us what they were told about how their father died, or where he was laid to rest, or whether anyone ever thought to ask. Somewhere in America today, it is entirely possible that his descendants are alive, carrying his name or his features, without knowing it. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is simply what happens when a family's paper trail is cut this early. A line of people, walking around unaware that their ancestor once held a razor to the throat of Abraham Lincoln every morning, and was trusted. Historians are still looking, somewhere perhaps, in a records office or a church ledger, or a family Bible no one has opened in 160 years. There may yet be a document that finally says where William Johnson rests, or what his wife's name was, or what he himself might have wanted said about him, if anyone had ever asked while he was still alive to answer. Until that document surfaces, if it ever does, this is the fullest and most honest version of the story that can be told. Not the tidy one, but the true one. What we are left with, in the end, is an envelope, somewhere in the executive mansion on a January afternoon in 1864. Abraham Lincoln counted out a dying man's wages, folded them inside a piece of paper, and wrote a name across the front. Carefully, a reporter noted, as though the writing itself mattered as much as the money inside. It was a small act. It was never meant to be remembered by anyone. And yet, of everything that happened between these two men across 4 years, the razor at the throat every morning, the letters of recommendation, the 6 hours on a train with a wet cloth, the mortgage quietly guaranteed, the grave that may not even be his. It is that one careful envelope that survives most clearly of all. Not a monument, not a headstone with the right name on it, in the right cemetery, over the right man. Just a president, alone at his desk, taking a few minutes to get one thing right. A name written carefully. That much, at least, is certain.